Hello and welcome to episode 78 of the Page One podcast. I'm Tarek.
I'm Marco, and thanks for joining us at the Page One podcast, where we'd like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, how they got into the industry, and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. We've got a great back catalogue of authors, screenwriters, video game writers, comic writers, journalists. Anything else I've missed out there? All types of writers.
Yeah. We've not got a cook on yet. Chef.
Yeah, maybe that's
Chef
what we need to go on.
Yeah. That's
but there would definitely be some names that you know there and names you want to listen to, so do please check out the back catalogue. But we've got a great guest this week.
We do indeed. This week we are chatting with MJ Arlidge, who has a varied career. He's a novel writer, but he didn't get into novels till he was in his 40s. He actually made his entrance to the writing world through TV. Eastenders was the big one for him. Storylining, which is an interesting thing.
Yeah, we talked to him about that, yeah. Yeah,
and he's went on to do storylining and editing Monarch of the Glen, Mistresses for Channel 4. In fact, Mistress was a show that he created. So I think he's created his own products on TV.
And I think recently he had Innocent on ITV as well.
That's right, yeah. So he's done a lot of kind of classic TV that a lot of folk have watched. He's been involved in some way.
And he chats to us a lot about the difference between the sort of TV world and publishing world, and how starting out in the TV world has helped, I think, in publishing. We hear about, how he got his agent and how he pitched his series and things like that. And that's definitely some influence that he brought from the TV world. Yeah. But he talks about the sort of pros and cons of each industry as well. So it's a really interesting chat and really fun. He's a lot of fun to chat to. Yeah. So we'll get straight into it after a quick advert for our writer's notebook, which, as we said last week, is undergoing a second printing. A new and improved version is coming out shortly, but you can go onto the website and put your name down so that you get a discount when that second printing is available.
But that's enough from us. On with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just a story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with Page One.
Did you always want to be a writer?
Well, I didn't think I did, but it was interesting. I was with a friend the other day from school, and he was talking about how at age, whatever he is, 46, he's still trying to find his purpose in life. And he remembered how when I was 15, I said to him I wanted to be a writer with utter conviction. And I have no memory of this whatsoever, but it obviously was there somewhere. But I think for me, I mean, like a lot of people who want to be writers or creatives of some sort, I sort of did what most people did and just went to work in the arts, sort of hiding behind other people who were doing the writing. So I was sort of producing, or I was script editing, or so, because I didn't quite have the nuts to actually do the writing myself and sort of put myself out there. So it took me a good, until I was nearly 40 to actually sort of take the plunge myself. But I think the idea of telling stories was certainly always there.
Am I right in saying that you first started working on Eastenders as a storyliner? Is that correct? Is that your first?
Yeah, that was one of the great times of my life. Is when I was 23 or 2, something like that, and I was about a year out of college, and I kept trying to get jobs at Eastenders because basically people burnt out there so quickly that there was always vacancies, which was great. So
that was a good sign.
Yeah, no, someone at film school gave me that tip and said, go for the soaps because people only last 18 months, so they're always looking. And I tried 2 or 3 times and didn't get in because I was very young. And on the 3rd attempt, I did get an assistant storyliner job. And so it was great fun because when all my friends were doing sort of terribly tedious law conversion courses, and I was helping in a very small way to storyline EastEnders. I think I was largely responsible for the stories that involved Wellard the dog and Sonia Jackson and all the kids and stuff. But that was absolutely fine because it just, when those episodes went out, and even if you only had one tiny little element that belonged to you, back then, 15, 16 million people were watching it, and that seemed rather exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And what is a storyliner exactly? What did that involve on a day-to-day basis?
Well, it pretty much involves a lot of what I do now, which is basically there was a massive whiteboard, absolutely the biggest thing I've ever seen, and essentially you had to plot 6 months in advance for EastEnders, and so exactly know what was happening, because we always filmed months. The Christmas special was always filmed in August and all that sort of stuff. So sort of you were always filming months and months in advance. And you just had to have these massive stories that could sustain 3 episodes a week for 6 months, So they were really, and there were sort of probably about 5, 6, 7 big ones going, and you'd have the sort of comic ones, but then the sort of big infidelities and bust ups and people dying and then coming back to life and all that sort of stuff. And that was just, in terms of an education when you were like in your early 20s of how to plot a story that can sustain 6 months, it was pretty amazing, really. And to be honest, and so that was sort of how I started out, and I was still very junior at that point. But then I graduated to script editing, and a lot of those skills that I learned there in terms of interweaving 5 different stories, 5 different POVs, and then building to a sort of cliffhanger basically in sort of 29 minutes. In a way, that's probably still how I plot a novel now. I never write in the first person. I can't do it. I find it too slow. I have to have say about 5 or 6 different POVs all interweaving, because it generates pace, and you can sort of spin off each other and then build to a sort of climax. And so I think certainly when I wrote Eeny Meeny, I think probably I was just approaching it like an episode of EastEnders, with very short chapters and multi POVs.
And how did you get into that role in the first place? If there's folk out there listening to this who kind of want to get into the TV world, what was your path to applying for that? And has that changed? Is there any tips you would give for that now?
Well, to be honest, it's such a long time ago, I wouldn't know how it works now, but I suspect it's the same. The BBC. So, I as I said, there was a guy at film school who said, look, target the soaps. And I thought, well, I've never really watched Coronation Street, so I can't really talk authoritatively like that. But EastEnders I do know, so I'll go for that one. And these jobs would come up, and I applied for one sort of through the normal channels to begin with, but then I met the exec and he said, look, I like you, but you're too young. But we sort of kept in touch, and when things became available, I sort of went for them, and I just kept sort of religiously watching the show. And then ultimately when they said, there might be something in for you, I had to write sort of 3 potential storylines, and I found them the other day when I was clearing out the shed, which was quite entertaining, and that again was a really good sort of exercise in actually, can you tell a story with a beginning, a middle, and end, and so I did that. And I think there is no advice at all. If you have any personal in, I think that's amazing. If you know someone who knows someone who knows someone who works in either publishing or TV, it's always best to have some familiar name who can try and sort of shepherd you in, obviously. But I think the main thing for me was just persistence, because in a way, if you are half decent and you are persistent, in the end, you sort of can't fail, I don't think, because you only fail really when you give up. And I just sort of knew that was my route in. And in the end, as I said, after sort of hammering at the door 2 or 3 times, I eventually got in.
And since after EastEnders, you then, I think you worked on Monarch of the Glen, and also then went on to create shows for the BBC as well. I mean, how did that come about? You know, what does that involve exactly? Obviously, you're already known at the BBC and everything, but are you having to pitch something to a producer and stuff and see if it's something they want to do?
Well, I think, you know, there are 2 ways to sort of get into that industry. You can either work sort of in-house for the BBC, which a lot of people do because it's quite sort of safe and solid, or you can work for an independent production company. You know, there are lots of very famous independent production companies like Left Bank, who make The Crown, or you know, Mammoth, who make Bodyguard and so on. And I think that a lot of the more interesting work, I think, is done by the independent production company. So it's best to sort of work out, you know, you're always at the end of the program, it says who made it.
Yeah.
So you can, you know, or you can look in the BFI handbook or whatever. You can work out who the big ones are and just try and sort of get in, just try and get a foot in the door with one of those, because I think that most of the interesting work is there. I mean, for my particular route, you know, nothing is ever wasted in the sense that before I got my job at EastEnders, I was script reading for various companies, including one called Across Films, who made Mrs. Brown back in the day and made Monarch of the Glen. And they get sent so many scripts and books and all that sort of stuff that they can't be bothered to read them themselves. So they pay sort of students and people to read them and find out if they're half decent. And I'd basically been reading for Across for quite a long time. Then I got my job at EastEnders, but I'd always stayed in touch, and I sent them Christmas cards just to, which was sort of a strategic, you know, just to try and keep my name in the frame. And it really paid off. It was really interesting because I sent them a Christmas card on December, when was it, 2019. And then I was at EastEnders not 2019, I'm talking about back in there was been, oh my God, it's last century. But anyway, let's gloss over that. Anyway, let's just say I sent them a Christmas card at a certain year. And then I was at EastEnders and I went for a promotion. I didn't get it. And I thought it was really unfair because I thought I was good enough to do it. And I was really furious with them. And I went back to my office, and literally an hour later, the phone rang, and it was one of the old people from Across. And they said, look, we've got this show called Monarch of the Glen we're looking for a script editor, which was what I was doing. Would you like to come and chat? So I chatted and then jumped ship immediately and went to Monarch and worked on that for 2 happy years. And that was just a sort of simple example of how actually just never losing touch with people, being quite strategic, just keeping those relationships bubbling can really pay off. And it's only a Christmas card or whatever. It doesn't take much time, but it's really that personal touch, I think, is really important. And then so I started working for them first at Monarch and then pitching new shows. And really then you're just an independent producer who's trying to tap up the best writers, calling the agent, coming up with ideas yourself. That's what I did a lot of. I came up with an idea, but I wasn't an established writer. So I'd find somebody, and I worked with Chris Lang, who does Unforgotten for ITV, and Ed Whitmore, who's just done Viewpoint and Manhunt and other stuff. And you're working with some really nice crime writers. And so then it's just, you dream up these old days. And pre-COVID, you would then go in and meet with Polly Hill at ITV or Piers Wenger at BBC, whatever. And it's that brilliant pressure of going in and just pitching the idea, which I always loved. A lot of people hated it, but I love the pressure of that and the excitement of it. And of course, you can come out with nothing and you feel a bit of an idiot. But if there is a bit of a bite, it feels very exciting that you sort of caught their interest. And it's an exercise in how, it has relevance to both TV and, of course, for books, when actually you've got to have a log line on the front, which is 1 sentence, or on the back, which is 2, which can hook you immediately. And I think that sort of brevity is the soul of wit thing really applies to pitching. So that's what I did, and that's sort of up until recently what I still did. And for me, I think the nice thing about being in the independent sector is it forces you to be quite sharp, because your job is to create and produce new shows for your independent production company, and if you don't have any success, they'll fire you. And so that sort of does sharpen the mind a little bit, and I quite enjoyed that pressure. I think not everybody does, but I thought, whereas the BBC, I think it's sort of sometimes a little bit more sort of staid and sedentary, and I think sometimes a little pressure is good, I think.
And you've written for a lot of TV shows over the years, Silent Witness, etc. A lot of big shows, a lot of varied shows, and I kind of wondered, how does that work? Is that something that when you get enough experience and exposure, they come to you and say, do you want to write for like an episode or join the writers team, or is it a case of you pitching saying I would like to write for the show?
Well, very much the latter. I mean, I think the times when people come to you and offer you something is only happens if you're Jed Mercurio or whoever it may be. You know, I think everything you gain in TV and probably publishing too, you gain by basically just being really persistent and saying, what about this? What about this? I mean, obviously in every area, both publishing and TV, the role of your agent's pretty crucial, you know. And I think when I was a producer, I didn't need an agent. When I after the books had started being successful and I wanted to write full time, I got a screenwriting agent, and they were very good pals with the people at Silent Witness. So I got in there relatively quickly. And I think when people ask me about getting novels published, I almost say it's sort of harder to get an agent than it is to get published in a way. You know, once you've got an agent, your chance of being published suddenly rises 100%, you know. But actually, without an agent, it's really tough. You know, obviously there's self-publishing, and a lot of people go successfully that route now. But I think getting an agent is the key thing, because it's their job to know what people are looking for. It's their job to have relationships with the best producers or the best publishers or whatever it may be. But no, I mean, pretty much, you know, everything you gain in this world, I think you gain by just pitching, knocking on doors. And eventually someone will give in and just get bored of you and say, oh, okay, fine, you know. And but it takes, you know, I think it's really not, I mean, particularly TV, publishing is possibly slightly nicer, but I think TV is not an industry for the faint-hearted. Do you know what I mean? It's full of very ruthless people. And lots of people want to be TV writers or actors or whatever. And, you know, I remember when I was producing at these places, and you get these really good actors who are coming in to audition for you, and you're like a nobody, really. You're like sort of a young 20-something, and David Morrissey, all these people are coming in. And still, despite their fame, they're still having to some degree, you know, sing for their supper, you know, and you have to have really thick skin, I think, in the TV industry. But yeah, you just have to keep pushing and keep pitching yourself. So
after working in the TV world, what was it that made you decide, right, it's a novel that I want to write in that first instance?
Well, because I think, I mean, I started work on Eastenders in the late 90s, and then throughout the noughties was working there. And then sort of, I realized I got to a point where I was getting really annoyed because I was coming up with ideas for TV shows, and then I was having to find writers. And it was around the time when writers started creating their own production companies so they could have more control and a bigger share of the spoils. And so it became increasingly hard to get people to work for you because they wanted to do their own stuff by their own company. And so that wasn't very attractive for us. And in the end, I had too many ideas where I'd pitched a really good idea, and then I'd waited for a writer, and then they said, yeah, I'll do it. And then 6 months later, they say, oh, actually, no, I can't do it. And you wasted all that. You know? So I thought, I've just got to write it myself. But I was very aware in TV that there are an awful lot of producers who think they're writers, and then they announce to the TV industry, right, I'm now a screenwriter, and they fall flat on their arse, and the public humiliation is quite large. And I was desperate to avoid that. So I thought, well, maybe I'll write a book, because if the book doesn't get published, nobody will know, and I won't have humiliated myself. And you know, and so then I came up with a plan, because there was this idea which became Eeny Meeny, which I always thought was a really nice, a pleasingly unpleasant idea. And I thought, well, how do I prosecute this? And so I wrote the book and had a vision of how things might pan out in terms of it getting picked up and published. And it's the only time in my entire life that the plan has gone completely right. Do you know what I mean? And normally you have a vision of where your life's going to be, and it sort of goes slightly sideways. You're always 50% successful. This one worked completely, and it was very rare and gratifying. But then it was nice. And for me now, it's good because I can work in two industries. So that's a little more job security, I suppose. And it's also different. I mean, the publishing world is generally full of nice people. The TV world generally isn't. And it's nice to be able to sort of flip between the two.
And did you go about the book the kind of the traditional way that, you know, a lot of folk do in terms of finding an agent first to pitch the book and then get the book read and then pitch it to the publishers, or did you kind of have a foot in the door through the TV work? No,
I wrote the whole book first. So I sort of planned it and then I wrote it. And then again, I was slightly sneaky in the sense that there were a couple of people who worked in publishing who I knew, who worked for Headline and various other publishers. And I just said to them, and they didn't work in crime, but I said, can you just ask your crime editor who are the best agents to represent crime editors? So they went away and they came back and said, our crime editor said X, Y, and Z. So I wrote to all those people, and I used the crime editor. I put the crime editor's name in the subject heading, so at least agents would recognize the name and they'd open it. And I said, dear so and so, X, Y, and Z told me, suggested I write to you. And of course, that was half true, because I'd never actually had a conversation with that woman. It was just sort of relayed, and it wasn't completely untrue either, because that's what she had recommended. So I just made it sound possibly as if I knew her, and she'd recommended I write it. So I thought, well, at least they might read the first page of the book, because she's not a schmuck, and they like what she has to say. It was interesting. And Ian Rankin's agent came back immediately and said, I'd like to meet. So I met him and we had a nice chat. He wanted to take the book in a way that I wasn't entirely thought was right. And so I met a few other people. And then in the end, I went with the only one who took me out to lunch. But that wasn't the reason. That was, the reason is that she was she was only 25. She was very hungry and she had great notes. And I'd originally sent it to her boss, but he had too many people on his book, so she took me on instead. And again, it's proved that Eeny Meeny was the best-selling crime debut that year, so it worked out obviously very well for me, but good for her as well, and was a nice launch pad. But yeah, so again, I think you have to be slightly cute in the way that you just try and get people to read the first page, because obviously, especially now you're hearing that agents. A lot of people wrote their novel in lockdown, when they had nothing else to do. I think there are an awful lot of novels swimming around now.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think it's, and I always remember that, I remember having a chat with one of the top guys at Penguin, the top crime guys. And he said, even if you get a solicited script, i.e. something that an agent has spoken to you about and you ask for it, you often have to read it at the weekends, like on a Saturday. And part of you is praying it's shit. So that you can, in a way, so you can put it down and get on with your life. If it's good, that causes a problem, because then you think, do I want to bid for it? Blah blah blah. And I always remember that and sort of thinking, okay, so even for the ones that they actually want to read, still part of them doesn't want to read it. Yeah. So if it's completely unsolicited, how much are they going to want to read it? So it's just about doing anything you can to suggest that it might be worth 5 minutes of their time, I think. And then if you've got, a good first chapter, maybe you can get further down the line.
Do you think it sounds to me like your experience in those pitch meetings for TV and stuff helped you in your approach as well to the agents and getting your foot in the door there, even though you didn't have experience in that industry as such, but you were able to use those skills in finding your agent in the end?
Oh, definitely. And I think it's sort of, TV people are quite pushy, because you really have to be, everyone's sort of got their elbows out. And I think, a lot of novelists are great at pitching themselves, but a lot of novelists are actually people who like to spend a lot of time by themselves in a room, and actually don't really like other people and are not brilliant at self-promotion. And I think, and also are not brilliant at thinking sort of possibly further down the line. So when I went in to talk to Penguin about Eeny Meeny, I pitched them the first 7 novels in the series, which obviously was completely over the top and a ridiculous show of hubris. But I knew that in TV you think in big numbers. Nobody wants a single film issue piece. Everyone wants the next CSI. They want things that can run and run and run. And I always remember I used the F word, franchise, which they loved. They thought that was marvelous. This is sort of most authors don't use that word because it sounds terribly tawdry and commercial. And actually, but for them, if you're writing commercial crime, which I am, I'm not trying to win the Booker Prize. I'm trying to create really page-turning thrillers. In a way, that's what they want, and they want to know that once you've done one, you might be able to do another and then another, because it is the Chris Carters and the Robert Brindizes and those people who do it regularly that actually is the bread and butter. Because people like Rankin, they're massive, obviously, but they, I don't know how often Ian writes a book now, but it's probably one over every sort of 2 or 3 years, and that's great. But actually, if you can do it year on year and slowly build that readership, that's what they're looking for. And I guess that's that's sort of the way I went about it. And I think a lot of novelists sort of collapse exhausted over the line with their first novel and don't necessarily have an idea of what to do next, because that's the one they've always wanted to write, or whatever it may be. But I was sort of quite clear that I felt that, it had legs. And even now people say, well, how many Helen Grace do you want to do? And I can't remember. I think I've written 10 now, and I think I'm just writing the 11th now. And you sort of think, well, why not do 20? Why not sort of be bold? As long as you're still here and people are still interested in her, then go for it, because there seems to be an insatiable appetite for crime, so one might as well sort of feed it.
well, the latest one is Truth or Dare, and it is number 10, I think, as well, and that's out on June 24th. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about the book, and then we'll chat about the series as well.
So Truth or Dare is possibly the most complicated one I've ever written. It's the only one I've ever had to write a massive diagram, a bit like being back at EastEnders, where to try and keep the connections in my head, because it is very Byzantine, but I think it's probably the best one I've written so far. And it's about a crime wave that suddenly grips Southampton, a series of sort of brutal murders for which there seem to be no suspects or indeed any clues. And Helen and Charlie and the team investigate. And even when they do start to make progress, things scarcely become any clearer, because the perpetrators seem to have no connection with their victims or indeed any motive for killing them. So it seems as if the city's basically sort of descended into this madness, this sort of chaos of murder and brutality. And then slowly, as Helen starts to sort of piece together the connections, she realizes that perhaps there is a rhyme or reason to this sudden crime spree. And of course, it falls to her to work it out and divine the shadowy puppet master behind it all. So that's it, basically. It's sort of set on a hot, steamy summer in Southampton, where everyone seems to be going mad. And it's different from the normal ones. Quite often there is one serial killer perpetrating multiple murders, and you're trying to just work out who they are. This one, as I say, it's multiple perpetrators, multiple victims, all sorts of craziness, and Helen very much at the heart of it all.
Excellent. And when you're writing a series of books like that, you've sort of alluded to already that you're sort of thinking ahead, but each book is obviously its own thing, but you've got the characters, especially Helen, going through them all. Do you have in your head even a long-term plan for where you want Helen to go, or do you just sort of deal with that when you start your new book and say, right, where is she now?
Well, I think it depends. There are two sort of conflicting imperatives, really. One is to try and make each book feel demonstrably different to the one before. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the Doll's House, which was the third one, was incredibly claustrophobic in interior, and about a girl trapped in a house and trying to escape. And, it was very claustrophobic. So I knew that the next one, Liar Liar, really wanted to be epic. So it was about arson, multiple fires everywhere. It was on a much bigger scale. And then the fifth one was very much about Helen's personal life. So I changed it up again. So I'm always trying to sort of just keep changing it. But obviously Helen is a through line. And the way it works is because it's impossible really to have a through line that lasts 20 novels. You would have to be pretty prescient and brilliantly thought through to do that. And so I think what I tend to do is I tell sort of mini arcs for Helen. So there'll be a story for her that runs over 2 books, or in this case, 3 books. And then we'll reset and start again. And it's all in the interest really of pushing Helen really. And so, because oftentimes she doesn't have a relationship. In recent books she has, now that's turned a bit sour. So sometimes I try these sort of mini arcs over 2 or 3 stories. I think really just because then you can tell an interesting beginning, middle and end for Helen, and then something will change and we'll go again. And I think that's the sort of way I do it. To think any further ahead is sort of a bit crazy, especially if you're only doing 1 book a year, which I'm doing, because otherwise you'll be sort of planning 4 years ahead. And I'm sure that sort of, it's like J.K. Rowling. I'm sure she had a sort of idea of where she was going, but I think a lot of it developed as she went along, and so it's a little bit like that. But I think, the main thing for me is you have to feed the character. That people like Helen and Charlie and they want them to be well, but it's also for me making sure that each book has an interesting antagonist, somebody that you're genuinely interested in, who is genuinely criminally insane in an interesting way, that each one is a really enjoyable standalone thriller. So because I think when I was a development producer for TV and I was reading all these books, a lot of them you could tell hadn't really worked out the ending, when they started. And so you get to the, and I think there's nothing worse than a shit ending. You know, when you've sort of read through 450 pages and you think, oh, okay, that's a bit annoying now, you know. And so for me, I mean, in terms of process, I pretty much always start at the end and work backwards, just because I think, for me, that the climax of the book is the whole point. And if you don't, you know, it's the meaning of the book as well. And if you don't have a proper ending, then you don't actually have a story. You might have an interesting beginning or a nice idea or whatever, but actually, for me, the payoff is the whole point, really. So, so you have to make sure that's rock solid.
And I think I read in an interview you gave that you're a pretty meticulous planner, that, you know, you do 2 to 3 months planning and then 2 to 3 months writing of the book, and you have to kind of know what's going to happen in a chapter before you even start to write it. And I mean, I suppose, first of all, is that right? And second, how do you combat the fear of, I'm just going through the motions, I've taken the kind of fun of the writing out of it by planning too much? Is that something you've ever kind of worried about?
A little bit, but I mean, I think it's quite funny because that literally goes back to Eastenders, when, you know, occasionally a writer would be terrible or they would pull out for whatever, and suddenly the script editor was left basically writing the episode, and they were filming it next week, and it was just, you know, and you had the first AD in the corridor going, "Where's that effing script?" You know, going nuts. But and you just had to just do it. And the way I always did it is I knew that there were roughly 20 to 25 scenes in an episode, or maybe a bit more. And so I would just literally write bullet points, you know, scene 1, this happens, scene 2, this happens, you know, and then I would look at the structure and, okay, actually that's a bit repetitive, scratch that. And that's pretty much exactly what I do now, except that it's over 140 chapters. And I know that in the first episode this happens, then we'll pick up Helen in the second one, you know. And so I absolutely know exactly what happens in each chapter before I start. And then as you're writing, you realize that actually maybe you don't need that chapter because you've covered it there, and you pull bits out and you change it around. And I think there is a danger always, if you know exactly what's happening, it's not going to be that fun to write. But I think the difference is, I suppose, for me, is that if I do that, I know I can write 5 chapters a day, basically. Yeah. And I go at it quite hard and fast, which I find quite exciting. And I sort of basically got an hour or 2 to write each chapter, and I've got to nail it and just get it down there. And I find that quite exciting. But also, you know, even as you're writing it, things happen and people say things that you know, it's a bit of a cliche, but they do say things you weren't expecting them to say. Mm-hmm. And you think, oh shit, that hadn't really occurred to me. But now, of course, you do that in that situation. So it does morph as it goes along. But I think, you know, for me, that planning I enjoy it. And it's also just one of those things, is that if you have a target, it's 140 chapters, you've got to do 5 a day. That's going to take you however long. What that does is it means you actually get a first draft down, you know, and in a way that's, whether you're, you know, Val McDermott or a first time writer, actually just getting the first draft is the thing, is that you know, you've written one, you know what it's like. It's just until you've got that, you've got nothing. Yeah. You know, and I think that's the thing, is just to get a first draft. That's obviously never going to be published. You're going to make it better, and an editor will make it better. But until you've got that, and then you can step away and look at it and read it all and think, oh, okay, it's a bit baggy there, and that doesn't make sense. You know, and so I think for me, that just guarantees me, okay, I will actually get that first draft done. And then the proper work can start. You know, once you've actually just sort of laid down a sort of base, the foundations, then you can start having a bit of fun. But it is a bit of a slog. You know, writing a novel is not an easy thing. But once you've got that, then you can start to make it better. So yeah, very meticulous. I don't find it boring. I find it quite exciting. And it just does mean I get it down, which is the main thing.
And does that process lead to, I mean, obviously you've just said that there is still work to do, obviously, after that first draft. But I mean, is it quite a clean first draft? Do you push through that first draft and say, right, I've done those 5 chapters, on to the next one? Or do you ever sort of revise what you're doing as you're writing it? Or do you wait until the first draft is entirely complete?
I mean, I think, you know, I don't know what everyone else is like, but I think writing a novel is a bit like sort of having a mistress. Is it sort of, you know, when the family are otherwise engaged, you sneak back up to your study and lock yourself away, and you can't quite leave it alone, I think, when you're writing it. I think you sort of, but I'm quite disciplined in the sense that I write sort of during the day, and then, you know, if the kids are doing something in the evening or I've got a spare moment, I'll creep back up and I'll just reread it and edit it myself, sort of a couple of chapters that I've done or whatever. So I think you are editing it and making it better as you go along. And of course that helps remind you also what you've written before, because again, writing a novel is quite a long thing and you can sort of forget what you wrote in chapter 3. So it's quite useful, and I think it's also reassuring, is that you start to think, okay, that's starting to feel quite tight, that opening now. That's quite good. So no, I I write during the day, and then I sort of stroke it and tinker with it in the evening, you know, when I can.
And with your sorry, Tarek, I was just going to ask. Obviously, you'll get your notes from your editor as well. I mean, how does that compare with the screenwriting world? Because when we've spoken to people that have worked in that world, it seems to me that you can get notes from 30 different people almost in that world, because there's so many people involved. Whereas with an editor, it's a much closer process, I think.
Yeah, I think it's basically much better in publishing in that sense. And I think the thing about publishing, if you've got a good editor, then they'll give you their notes, and generally you're sort of furious for a week. That's what I think is, you know, they should have the temerity to question this, and then you realise that actually all their notes are right, and that's quite annoying too. And then you think, I've actually got to do this stuff now. And I hate second drafts; they're the worst. First drafts I like, third drafts I like, fourth drafts I like. The second draft is awful. It's just sort of you're fixing all the stuff that you should have fixed before, and you're rearranging bits. It just feels awkward and clumsy, and then eventually you get it, and then it feels better. But at least it's quite clean, and if you have a good personal relationship with the editor, then you can have a bit of to and fro and a bit of explanation, and you can work things around. I think the thing with TV is just too many people in the room always. Yeah. Some of them even unseen, you know, just, I've spoken to my boss and she thinks this, or my boss's wife thought the first act was a bit boring, you know, or whatever it may be. And you do get a lot of that. And that's what's sort of ultimately slightly sort of debilitating, because you don't need that many people. You know, if you've got a good producer and a good script editor, that's plenty. You know, I mean, the Silent Witness experience for me, I enjoyed the first one. The second one was pretty bad. The third was terrible. And it got progressively worse simply because there were more and more people in the room. And I remember having one script meeting when there was 3 script editors in the room. And it literally was, how many script editors it takes to change a light bulb? Because what happens when they start disagreeing? Yeah. You know, and you sort of think, well, and I literally couldn't believe it. And I sort of, you know, maybe the script did need a lot of work, but you just, on any level, that's absurd, you know, and actually... And
they're probably trying to justify themselves as well for being there.
Yeah, of course, you know, they're getting paid whatever they're being paid by the BBC, so they have to say something, which is just the worst possible motive. And some of the best commissioners, I always thought, were the ones who said very little, or just said, look, I do like it, but it just needs to be more edgy, or it needs to be whatever, or just something that was just very simple, and you said, okay, I get where you're coming from. And again, it's that tendency to sort of micromanage, which you don't really get in editing in quite the same way. I mean, yes, they'll do line by line stuff and all the rest of it, but it generally tends to be more sympathetic than this desire to sort of correct your stage directions or something really sort of simple and banal. And you think, not sure that's really relevant. And I think that's the trickiest thing, is just charting your course. And ultimately, you have much less power, because the power lies with the execs and with the actors. And to some extent the directors, but not even them really. And so I think you're very expendable as a screenwriter, whereas as a novelist you're not. You know, you're all they've got for that particular series, so you're quite unexpendable. You know, and that's nice. You know, it does give you a feeling of confidence. And so I prefer writing books, but you know, I had a show called Innocent that was on ITV very recently, last month in fact, and by the same token, you can't deny that there is a thrill to seeing your name on the screen, you know, and that is TV is a sort of more exciting world, you know, but I think in terms of creativity, publishing sort of wins hands down, really.
And is what you've learned from being a script editor and stuff, I mean, I think you've already alluded to this as well, but, you know, you brought some of that structure and pacing into your novels to make them page turners, I suppose. Has that helped you in taking forward your novel writing?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's partly structural, is that, you know, when I was working as a script editor or producer in TV, there was an amazing amount of writers who are absolutely brilliant on atmosphere and dialogue, but absolutely couldn't structure a story to tell their life. They didn't understand really a beginning, middle, and end. It just didn't come naturally to them. I think if you're a crime writer or a comedy writer, both of which build to this huge either comic or thrilling payoff, structure is so important, I think, you know, because everything has to be note perfect really, and in the right place. So that was very important. Also, just the fact that I think I'm used to editing, so I basically edit myself. And so I think the difference is that I think what's useful for my editors, and I guess my team, is that when I deliver a first draft, there'll be work to do, but it won't be baggy. or unfocused or all over the shop. It'll be a very succinct presentation of the best I can do so far, and then they will make it better and enrich it. And you say, okay, yeah, that's obvious. We should have done that, But I think that makes a big difference, because I think, I'm sure I've never been a publishing editor, but I imagine sometimes you get this 700-page magnus opus, and you think, oh my God, where do we? There's a great novel in there somewhere, but where do we start? And I'm sure it becomes quite a sort of exercise in corralling it. So I try and keep things tight. But then, again, that's I remember when I wrote Eeny Meeny, I presented it proudly to the agents, and it was 50,000 words, which I thought was pretty long. And they said, no, it's 25,000 words too short, and which was a bit of a blow. And I realised that what I'd done is I was so scared of boring people that the chapters were like a page long or 2 pages long. They were so short, and there was no dialogue. It was just all action, And they said to me, look, you need a bit of dialogue so people can, they can't see the characters, they have to imagine them. So let's hear them speak so people can start to sort of visualize them. And they also said, which I think was really interesting, because Eeny Meeny was all about people being locked in a room together and having to decide which one lived and which one died. All the agents, 90% of whom were female, said, "Oh no, we need to spend much more time with the people in the box. We need much more emotional cruelty in this story." And I thought, that sounds fun. That sounds jolly. So suddenly these brief vignettes that I'd had of people, they expanded into 2-3 chapters of people really sort of being tortured, and it was great fun actually. I enjoyed that.
It's funny, you were saying there that your first draft of Eeny Meeny, your first book, didn't have very, very much dialogue, and I find that surprising, because I would have thought, coming from a script side of things, moving to novels, I kind of wondered, would you keep that mentality into the book and have a lot of dialogue and have a lot of showing, not telling, or did you lean the other way, and did you lean more into the kind of, this is just you in the book and you can tell the reader anything? It doesn't have to be in dialogue, it doesn't have to be open, it can just be, you just tell the reader something.
Yeah, well, I think sort of, TV is basically based around dialogue, because you generally don't have the amazing set pieces or the production values of film. I think I was trying to write a film in the sense that a lot of the best films do tell their stories through pictures rather than dialogue, basically, because they can. And I think that's what I was trying to do. I sort of thought, wouldn't it be great if you've got a blank canvas really as a book, so there's no worries about production values. You can do whatever you like, which is one of the great joys of it. And so I thought, I'll just go for that. And then I just realized that actually, what a character just going from A to B to C to D without actually speaking and telling you something about themselves and how they interact doesn't actually tell you very much. They're just character A doing something. And that was and the funny thing is how many novels you write or how many screenplays you write, you're still liable to make basic mistakes where you just think, oh, actually, come on, that's obvious. That's massively expository, or my God, that character says nothing throughout the entire book, and you just make these mistakes time and again. And each time you do it, you sort of learn, and hopefully as you go along, you get a bit better. But it was just a mistake, and it was pure fear for me, I think, in the end, of just trying to keep it as short as possible so people didn't turn off, but it was in the end I'd edited it too tight, and it needed a little room to sort of breathe. And it's really interesting. I mean, the ending of Eeny Meeny is quite brutal. Is you get to the end, there's a terrible payoff, and then it ends. And I remember quite a few people, both within the publishing house, but also readers, just saying that they felt they needed a bit of an epilogue or some time to calm afterwards. And pretty much ever since then in books, I've just sort of tried not to punch the reader in the face and then say the end. I've tried to sort of just let it just smooth and just have, okay, the dust will settle now. This terrible things happen, but perhaps all will be well, and so you learn those little things as you go along. But that's just experience, I guess.
And you've also done some work for Audible as well, I think, 6 Degrees of Assassination. And what was it like? I suppose that's almost like another field that you work in the world of audio only, sort of radio play type stuff. Is that another, was that fun playing in that sandbox as well?
Yeah, it's very odd, sort of, because you're having to rely obviously completely on sound. And actually, once you start to realize that and you play to your advantage is that silence is kind of incredibly powerful in audio. Like when someone's creeping through a house or treading on broken glass, you can actually have some really good fun if people can't see. And they're like, what's going on? What's going on? And you can really start to play with that. But it is quite hard because you've got the production, you've got these amazing production values because you can pretty much do whatever you want.
Yeah.
But I'd never written audio drama before. And generally I haven't been a massive fan because it tends to be, you turn on Radio 4 at the wrong time and you get some sort of awfully earnest sort of, and you just, oh my God, do people actually commission this stuff? It's so boring and so old fashioned. And so I was trying to write an audio thriller, and they were very keen, Audible, to be the sort of Netflix of audio, creating lots of original content. And I think I'd always had this idea, 6 Degrees of Assassination, which I thought was quite a funky idea. And when somebody offers you an outlet, whether it's audio, publishing, TV, then you sort of take it because it's fun.
Yeah.
The money's terrible, so you have to get your head around that and sort of work out whether that's worth your while doing it. But I was interested in trying a new medium, and Audible are obviously a great company, and they were really pushing it hard. And of course, you've got a cast. You had Andrew Scott, the sexy priest from Fleabag, and from Spectre, and Hermione Norris, and lots of other amazing people in it. And that was just amazing to go down to the recording studios and meet those guys and chat to them. So, of course, because it's only 2 days' work for them, like an 11-part series or whatever. So that was lovely. And I always remember my agent, Helly, turning up. And Andrew Scott is gay, which is no secret, and very gay. And he's out there. But still, he's so sexy that I remember my agent hiding her engagement ring sort of behind her back, even though she knew that this was not an option and there was no chance. She was still so dazzled by him that she kept her engagement ring hidden. But that was fun. And and I just think, I guess the freedom of either writing books or audio where you just don't have those production or those budgetary constraints is very exciting. And to write a thriller, like a sort of breathless, hooky thriller like that, was really good fun.
It's like I've listened to a few now because Audible have so many of them now, and obviously they vary massively in quality, but sometimes it is, as a writer, it must be difficult to portray things in a scene when it is only audio. You get, the worst examples are you get the person saying, "Oh no, don't do this to me with that massive knife that you're suddenly holding," and all the, is there a skill in making it seem real but also conveying enough information, I suppose?
Yeah, no, I mean, the exposition is hard. It's really hard. And you have to be quite canny. I mean, I think the thing about doing a thriller is quite nice because anything that involves a lot of interrogation is easy. Do you know what I mean? It's very easy to work out who's in the room and what's happening, and you can get the conflict, the to and fro. So there was quite a lot of that, which is good. But also you can do quite a lot with surprises. So again, I mean, it starts with an assassination, and so you've got somebody who, security officers talking to each other, and then suddenly a shot rings out, and suddenly there's chaos, and that's quite easy to do. And again, that doesn't need much explanation. You get that, and so you can play some nice surprises with sound that you can't do elsewhere. But exposition is the devil of every sort of genre, of every type of writing, isn't it? But it's particularly hard with audio, isn't it? Because you have to explain certain things, and it's sometimes you can hear the creaking exposition as you go along. But sometimes you have to live with it.
And I suppose sound effects can be massively helpful, obviously, and it's not just the dialogue, it's the sound. And there's a good Alien one I listened to the other week there, and it was helped massively by the fact you had the sound of doors opening up and closing and computer voice saying stuff and footsteps and alien, and that must be knowing when to lean into when to let the sound effects do the heavy lifting and when to let the speech do the heavy lifting. That must be quite an art to work out the best way forward.
No, and I think it's, again, especially in a thriller, there's so much you can do. I mean, even just sirens sort of slowly getting louder, you understand
exactly
the police are coming, and it's just little things like that. Or the classic one when you're in a intensive care and you've got the beep beep of the thing, and then the flatlining. Again, you know exactly what's happening there because that's such a sort of part of grammar now that people understand. Okay, someone's having a cardiac arrest or whatever it may be. So absolutely. But again, I think in the end, it is something which really good dialogue works well, because you can have a very a really good, tense, sharp exchange between two characters on audio is just as good as on TV. You know, it's just in some ways better because you can sort of imagine it in your head. And I think, again, we had really good actors, which was great. So you could really sort of give them some good lines. But yeah, no, absolutely. But I mean, that was, I think, the biggest learning curve I've had writing that, because I just wanted to write in pictures. You know, I was so used to writing in pictures. Oh, shit, I can't do that. All right, how do I get this character to say that in a subtle way? You know.
So what's next? Obviously, Truth or Dare's coming out, and I think you said you've just finished a draft of the 11th book in the Helen Grace series. Have you got anything planned beyond that?
Yeah, so So yeah, Helen Grace I'm doing now. I'm then going to do a standalone, which will be exciting. So that'll be something completely non-Helen Grace. I can't tell you what it's about yet, because that we haven't decided. But there's a kind of 2 or 3 options that we're just noodling around, which will be quite fun because, again, I think, you know, chasing serial killers around Southampton is enormous fun. Occasionally, so the other standalone I wrote, A Gift for Dying, was set in Chicago, and that was amazing fun because, you know, America is so balmy and so much more dangerous than this country that you can have enormous fun when everyone has guns and you know, it's sort of it's easy to disappear and all that sort of stuff. So it's quite likely to be US set because I really enjoyed the scale of that, and just writing in the city of skyscrapers and all that sort of stuff was enormous fun. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm starting to do more original thing for TV. I've done Innocent, but that was co-written with Chris Lang, who writes Unforgotten as well. And so I'm developing a pilot for the BBC and then a pilot for Alibi, which is a crime-only cable channel. And they're original, very different pieces. One is a sort of Big Little Lies, The Undoing, that sort of... there seems to be a real fashion, and I love them for the sort of quite high-concept crime melodrama. Yeah, with some of this unashamedly big and bold melodrama, but it's absolutely not procedural. Just it's about people's lives falling apart. Hugh Grant, is he a cad or is he not a cad? All that sort of stuff, which is lovely. So I'm doing one of those, and then the BBC one is much more sort of broad-church, but with a very, very big twist, which I'm very excited about as well. But those both early stages, I've sort of done the pilot scripts, so we'll wait and see what everyone thinks about them. But you know, there are lots of opportunities opening up in TV and elsewhere for crime writers, and I would love to try, if both industries will have me, to keep writing for both of them, because it is, you know, after 6 months of solitary confinement in the publishing world, it's quite nice to go and go and work in TV for a bit. And you know, publishing used to be obviously quite sociable, well, to a degree, in terms of all the events and the festivals and stuff, but now particularly it's a very solitary profession, and so it is quite nice. Sometimes it's quite nice to have 3 script editors in the room, if only for the comfort.
Would you want to write a movie ever?
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, I think in a way it would be lovely to write for all mediums, you know. So yeah, I mean, I've got loads of movie ideas. It's partly about having the time, and also in this industry, I mean, the TV industry here is thriving, but small compared to America. The film industry here is sort of a cottage industry compared to America, you know. And I think it would be very hard. And I'm not sure how many screenwriters, film could actually enjoy the process for film. I think it is, you get so far, then you get fired, and then someone totally rewrites it. But I think I'd love to do a play as well. I mean, John Fowles' book, The Collector, is something I've always. I don't know if you read it. The idea of a guy who basically he's autistic, and he basically covets this girl, an art student who he's absolutely in love with. And so one day he basically just sort of takes her, and he sort of keeps her in his cellar, and she obviously is trying to escape her. And then she gets unwell, and he's sort of trying to work out, should he try and go to the doctor? But obviously that way, you know, and it's a sort of very tense two-hander that I've always thought would work amazingly well as a sort of stage play. If you imagine you're in the basement with them, basically, you know, and that's your, you know. So I'd love to do something like that, which is just really tense and unforgiving, and but you know, ultimately, you know, just a great piece of writing. So I'd love to do that. It's just finding the time. But yeah, why not? Let's do them all.
What was the last book that you read?
What was the last book that I read? What am I reading at the moment? I think the last one I read was it'll be a Patricia Highsmith one. I constantly sort of go back to her, and I've just reread The Cry of the Owl, which is my favorite, which is about a woman who falls in love with her own stalker, which is quite a strange idea, but very interesting. So yeah, she I sort of always sort of go back to her every now and again, because I just think she's my favorite.
I've not read it in first. I've got Talented Mr. Ripley on my shelf, but I've never read it.
Yeah, well, that's great. Strangers on a Train, classic, of course, as well. So can't beat her. She's just so. There are like no nice characters in her books at all. Everyone is a sinner in this sort of terrible fallen world, which it's so noir. I love it. I love it.
And what about the last film that you watched?
The last film that I watched, what was that? It was The Sound of Metal, the one that's just
Riz Ahmed.
the Oscars with which again I thought was astonishing. Just brilliant. Riz Ahmed, brilliant performance, and just great. It just really, a lot of I think the Oscar nominated films here this year were just quite innovative and interesting. I enjoyed Nomadland as well. I thought that was very moving really as well, and just gave you an insight into what it's like to work in an Amazon factory, and just I was pleased, because sometimes you get those years in the Oscars back in the old days when it was sort of Titanic or Avatar, and you sort of feel a bit dirty. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of, these at least were interesting films, and you could watch them. So I enjoyed those a lot.
And the last TV show that you watched or are watching?
The very last one I watched was last night. My kids are very into Meet the Goldbergs, which is very funny. And I grew up in North London in the 80s, and although I'm not Jewish myself, everyone I knew was Jewish. And so the snapshot of a Jewish household in the 80s feels very familiar to me, and it's very good to spend some time with them. And the kids love it, because it's about that time when you're sort of a tweenie and then a teenie, and things are becoming really awkward, and parents are sort of hideously embarrassing, and sex is raising its head. And so it's quite educative. It prompts some interesting discussions in our household afterwards.
Nice. And the very last thing we do is a quick fire, either or. And I always say there's no right answers apart from one. And we'll start off with James Patterson or Thomas Harris.
Thomas Harris.
Nice.
Line of Duty or Mayor of Easttown?
Mayor of Easttown.
TV or cinema?
Cinema, probably.
Night Owl or Early Bird?
Early Bird. Actually, no, both. I don't sleep much.
And the last one, we'll go for print book or ebook?
Print, obviously.
Unfortunately, that was the incorrect answer there.
Shame.
We're doing pretty well up to then.
Yeah, blew it at the last. Never mind.
So, Tarek, what we've learned there is that you need to pitch your first book as a 7-book series.
That was a problem. I was 6 books short when I pitched mine.
Exactly, yeah.
It's funny because that does go against all the advice. You always hear that, don't pitch as a series. Series potential maybe, but but he really went out the gate with that idea, and that's obviously, I presume, something that from the world of film and TV, that kind of idea of this is long form, it's got to have legs, you've got to show you can keep it going down the road, and
I think as well, yeah, absolutely. And what he was saying about, I think especially if you're starting out as an author, you can be sort of hesitant to say that, as he said, the word franchise and sort of act like it's a commercial thing, but actually that's what publishers want to hear. They want to sell books ultimately.
Absolutely, it is commercial. I mean, and nowadays, look at stuff like Star Wars and Marvel, etc. It's all about franchise. It's all about showing this is a product which you can expand and make money off. And you're right, there is a hesitancy there, I think, from new authors. And that's because they've often been told not to do that. But you're right. At the end of the day, it's a money-making industry that's about making money and selling books.
Yeah, you can write the greatest book in the world, but if the publisher doesn't think they're going to be able to sell it, then it's unlikely to get picked up, unfortunately.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
and there's is that right or not? I don't know, probably not, but it is the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
So thanks very much to Matthew for speaking to us. Really enjoyed that chat. You can go and pick up his latest book in the Helen Grace series, Truth or Dare, as we were chatting about there. So I do highly recommend that, and go and check out the past books as well, because they're all great.
It's a fantastic series.
And we're looking forward to seeing what he has next on TV as well.
Very exciting. A man of many talents.
Exactly.
Mr. Arlidge.
And actually, he talked about the Audible thing there as well, which is
that's quite interesting.
it's a really we've had Dirk Maggs on before, who's very much sort of the king of audio drama, but it's always interesting that it's such a different form of writing as well, because you have, as we were chatting about, how do you get certain things across in that form and stuff like that.
Yeah,
so.
it's really, when it's done badly, it really sticks out.
Yeah.
But when it's done well, it draws you in way more than just an audiobook does, because you're it's like a radio play. It's really fantastic.
Yeah. So thanks again to Matthew for coming on to the podcast. I really enjoyed that. But we've got another great guest next week.
Yeah, next week we're chatting with Philip Gwyn Jones, who has worked in Edinburgh, much like ourselves, although he's from Wales. He spent 20 years in IT, and then he moved to Italy when he was made redundant, and he became a translator, and he kind of threw it all away and went to Italy. It says on his website he worked for the European Space Agency, but he kept that quiet.
Yeah, we didn't ask him about that.
I don't think that's
But he didn't just move to any city, Derek. He moved to Venice, which
That's
is
right.
For me very special, since I've got family there. But he sort of almost fell into writing by accident when he was there, and he started writing. I think he wrote a memoir first, but then started writing thrillers, all set in Venice with this character Nathan Sutherland. His first one, I think, is The Venetian Legacy, and
The Venetian Game.
Oh, The Venetian Game. Sorry, The Legacy is the latest one then,
That's
obviously.
right.
Sorry. And he's got a fascinating tale about how that suddenly propelled him to a whole new career, because a year after publishing, I think, Waterstones picked it as their book of the month, and suddenly it
Massive
took
impact
off from there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Which
he's
is
a
incredible.
really nice guy. It's a really fun chat we have with him. And yeah, he's had quite as many of our guests in the past, a very different entry to the world of writing. So it's another way in.
Exactly. So I hope you can join us for that one. But if you enjoyed this episode or any of our previous episodes, please do take time to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you listen to. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UK Page One, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.